Okay, my AP literature friends. So let's move on with this 2021 exam. And for those that don't know, earlier in the week, I posted on my YouTube channel FRQ1, which was Eyes, the Man with the Saxophone. So you can browse that too to get a sense of how to tackle the first question. And for FRQ2, the main thing I want to emphasize in this is the following. Nothing changes with regards to my templates. The introductions are going to write themselves exactly the same way as they did for the poetry, right? Even though we're doing a short fictional excerpt in this, the introductions are going to be done exactly the same, and I'll model it for you as always in this. So we're going to use the inverted thesis, and then for the body paragraphs, just as we did with Eyes, the Man with the Saxophone, we are going to tackle the body paragraph syllogistically. So I strongly encourage you to look at that video as well to see the exactitude, the exact similarity between the two. And the beauty of this, and I always say this, is that these templates will demystify the writing process for your students. They will just intuitively, instinctually, habitually know what to do if you introduce these templates early in the academic year and then they employ them throughout the academic year many times. They have many, many opportunities to use them, employ them, have some time to manipulate them and to master them. Come time for the exam in May, they're going to be holy rollers as far as the writing goes, which the great news is this, because since they know how to write, because they have these templates, in terms of they'll have strategies on how to have voice, rhythm, flow. They'll have tier 2 level vocabulary, which is your like SAT, average SAT level word. They will have mastery of all that stuff. So one of the things that I do is I coach a mastermind, and I teach teachers all of these strategies. I take them through the academies, the mini academies that I have in my classroom. So I do things on the fact that there are 12 sentence constructs, and that in order to have that voice, rhythm, and flow, students need to be able to manipulate all 12 of those. In order to have something that reads beyond what we've seen several times when we grade essays, that chop, 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 chop rhythm that we see so often in writing, and especially even the College Board samples, we see that. We're also going to see a pretty high academic tone in my student writing, because I do word study academies throughout the entire year. You're going to see my students not rely on to be verbs all that much. And in fact, you're going to see rather active verbs with them. So if you're interested in having like a 5-week course with me, we meet every Sunday at 7 p.m. and for 5 consecutive weeks, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and I take you through all those little academies that I have in the class, and then you'll learn how to incorporate these templates pretty masterfully into your own classroom instruction. So at the end, I have a link to my webpage, so you can email me to get more information on that. So let's take a look at some specifics here. One thing that I tell my teachers all the time when I teach them my templates is that you have to Bob Ross your instruction, which is kind of a goofy way of saying you need to provide plenty of exemplars and models in order for this to work. So just as I am going to paint through this essay with you, you should do the same with your students. So I position myself as the expert writer in the classroom. And let's say we're looking at this Winton piece, and I will say to the students, you can always declare or invert your thesis, but since we're doing literary analysis, we know that we're going to invert the thesis. So here's model 1 that I wrote, here's model 2 that I wrote, here's model 3 that I wrote. All right, you've seen it 3 times. On your mark, get set, go. That demystifies the writing process. So imagine Bob Ross comes on screen and he says that you're going to paint, a landscape. He doesn't pass out a graphic organizer and then mill around the room, putting out the fires of classroom management issues. He stands at his canvas and he paints with us. And I recommend and encourage teachers to do the same in their writing workshops. And you're going to see your students absolutely grow, mature, and flourish, especially if you're incorporating templates. All right, I've been talking enough, so let's get into the meat and potatoes of what we're going to do in this writing workshop. Here's the prompt. The following excerpt is from Tim Winton's novel Breath, published in 2008. In the passage, the main character, Bruce Pike, recalls an incident at a nearby river. Read the passage carefully, then in a well-written essay, analyze how Winton uses literary elements and techniques to represent the complex response of the narrator to the incident at the riverbank. This is average run-of-the-mill prompt. We've seen this many, many times on the AP literature exam. So this one was really not a curveball to our students, especially if they have seen enough exams and practiced enough exams with the FRQ2s. They could get their head around this pretty easily. So now it's just a matter of, analyzing the text with a certain degree of exactitude so that they have a correct interpretation. And I guess that's the other cool thing about templates. The writing takes care of itself after a while, so therefore you can spend a ton of time just reading a wide variety of texts, because after a while I think students will see that there are patterns and trends in each subsequent text that you provide to them, because there's only so many things theoretically and technically an author can do within the confines of fiction. So if they see like 10 pieces of like short story excerpts or novel excerpts like this, they can begin to see some connections between all of them. So that's what I like to do when I study and prepare for the exam. So here's the big kicker with regards to those prompts, and I demonstrated this in Eyes the Man with the Saxophone. Implicit in every single one of the College Board prompts that require students to do literary analysis are two questions. The first is, what is the authorial intent? And the second is, how does the author construct meaning? If the student answers both of those questions within the introductory paragraph, they have the thesis point. All right, especially if they've read the passage correctly, they definitely will have the thesis point. So those are the two questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? So notice, we did the exact same thing with poetry, with the man with the saxophone. Exact same thing with excerpts from novels or short stories. So literature is literature is literature. It doesn't matter. We could do this for, dramas as well. So how do I write the introductory paragraph for FRQ2? Here's the kicker. So the heuristics and templates can be used across the expository modes and genres. So this declarative and inverted model can be used for literary analysis, which we're doing, rhetorical analysis, synthesis, argument, persuasion, and research. And the only thing the students need to know is what expository mode they are writing in. So let me explain what the declarative is and the inverted. First, each introduction, while the training wheels are on, while the scaffold is on, when students are first learning this, each introduction is going to be 4 sentences long, no more, no less. I like my students to be concise, get out of the gate with a strong foundation without bloviating and getting wayward and doing all the things that we see them do sometimes, like bring in the textual support, begin quoting, begin paraphrasing, get plot heavy. 4 sentences is perfect, so that all they need to do is house the thesis and give context and background. That's it. That's the only move they need. So with the declarative, what you do is you start with the thesis, right? Your very first sentence is just boom, drop the thesis. and then the remaining 3 sentences are context and background. But as I said earlier, you got to focus on the tier 2 level vocabulary and the sentence constructs, because out of the gate, you want that pizzazz and that wow factor, right? Saddle your reader with something that's super impressive so that you're situating yourself high on the rubric. So if you invert, you're going to start with the context and background. So some students will start with a hook or an analogy, which is hard to do in timed writing situations, to come up with something poetic to say. And usually in literary analysis, my students don't use the hook or analogy. They do that for synthesis and argument on the Lang exam. So context, background, and then as you whittle it down towards the fourth sentence is going to be the thesis. So here is the other thing as far as literary analysis goes. We know that we have those 2 implicit questions. What is the authorial intent, and how does the author construct meaning? Here's how it breaks down. The first 3 sentences in the inverted method are going to answer the question, what is the authorial intent? So it's context, background, heavy thematic focus. Last sentence, you're answering the question, how does the author construct meaning? In answering that last question, you got your thesis. So you have to answer both questions. So let me reiterate that. Students for literary analysis to be safe, I'm not saying they only can, I got to be careful of my language, but they can pretty much guarantee themselves the thesis point if they invert the thesis. Declarative, I find, gets them out of the gate with plot summative statements, and we got to make sure they're not doing plot analysis. It's literary analysis. So first 3 sentences in the inverted, answering the question, what is the authorial intent? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? So let me give you 3 examples of how to do this. So here's the first, and the very first sentence, I call it the bingo statement. Like, bingo, this is exactly what Winton is doing. This is his authorial intent. This is why he wrote the passage. So very, very concise statement to begin with. All right, so look at this. It is common knowledge in parenting circles to think that you can't teach children to behave better by making them feel worse. So you see my student use the you. I'm okay with that. So sometimes it doesn't make it just doesn't flow if they're using one, if a parent, when one parent does this or that, difference between second and third person. So I'm okay with that. So I know some of you might not like that, but I'm okay with that. And I teach at the college level at a local private college here in upstate New York and in the SUNY system. And I know that my colleagues in the English department are okay with second person. So let me take that from the top again. It is common knowledge in parenting circles to think that you can't teach children to behave better by making them feel worse. Given this simple truism, it can be understood that when children feel better, they behave better. Tim Winton, however, challenges these tenets through the character of Loon and Bruce Pike, in that the former relishes and delights in his bad behavior, while Bruce, the spectator, feels an odd mix of pleasure, guilt, shame, and embarrassment. All right, so we've answered that question. What is the authorial intent? We have enough context and background, and we don't want to go any further because then we're gonna get too plot heavy. Fourth sentence, how does the author construct meaning? And this is where the student wants to use their terms and devices. So look at this. Through the manipulation of irony and paradox, Winton arrives at the strange and albeit liminal space of a child trying to manipulate the power balance that usually separates adults from children. So that's what the template's going to yield. 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? 1 sentence, how does the author construct meaning? You can see the sentence fluency in here is quite nice. Like that third sentence, the elongated sentence, that's complex to do. You have, declarative sentences in here. I think there's a parenthetical somewhere, if I recall. I think there's a parenthetical statement, and then, it has nice rhythm, voice, and flow. The vocab is up there, but it does, the kid doesn't sound like a goon, like a Princeton professor wearing a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, smoking a Sherlock's home pipe, right? When they stretch their vocab, we don't want them to sound contrived or pretentious. They're 16, 17 years old, but be the best academic you when you're right. That's what I always tell students. So here's another one going to follow the exact same template. Free play is important in a child's development because the kid learns how to make decisions independent of the parent, problem solve, and create and abide by a loose set of governing rules. So again, that's like bingo, that's the whole thing. That's what Winton is doing. So now flesh that out a little bit in 2 sentences, just unpack it, context, background. In this space of freedom, kids also learn the rules of how to be an equal, obedient, a subordinate, and a rebel. A part of childhood is learning how to navigate the arbitrary system of rules that define a kid's behavioral patterns, but sometimes kids are just kids and throw everything out the window. All right, that's 3 sentences of context, background. What is the authorial intent? Last sentence, let's bust out the terms and devices and answer the question, how does the author construct meaning? Winton explores these ideas in his excerpt through the juxtaposition of both characters' reactions to the woman and the paradoxical pull of being caught between childhood and adulthood. Same thing every time. So I'll show you a third one, exact same thing. 3 sentences, what is the authorial intent? Last sentence, how does the author construct meaning? Tier 2 level vocabulary, focus on the sentence constructs. Existing simultaneously in the spaces of shame, of guilt, speaks of 2 contradictory sentiments. The first says, I am bad. The second says, I did something bad. For Loon, his prank is a barrel of laughs that fosters no sense of internal struggle. But for Bruce Pike, this very same prank leaves him feeling an odd pull between shame, guilt, laughter, and an adult understanding of self-awareness. All right, that's the whole thing right there, right? We just put in a capsule the exact verbiage of what Winton is doing in the excerpt. Last sentence, let's use the terms and devices again. Winton investigates these heartstrings by juxtaposing Loon's reaction to the prank to the reaction of Bruce, and he also does this through a series of contrasting images. Right, so you focus on the most significant literary terms and or devices in that last sentence. So the ones that construct the meaning, right? The ones that do the big heavy lifting of the passage. So that's how the template of the inverted thesis works. And let's talk about what does not go in the introduction. Notice none of them are quoting. None of them get plot heavy. We don't want it to read like a Cliff Note synopsis. And each one is done within 4 sentences. So this is why I think 4 sentences is important, because it houses them, it keeps them concise, it keeps them focused. And I know some teachers have contended with me and said, but Christian, all they need is 1 sentence. And I'm like, yes, but how sophisticated is that? In comparing this template to the 1 sentence bagger, which one's more sophisticated? And then students can test again and they say, but Christian, they have all those essays to write in such tight time constriction. How can they do it? And my answer to that is, it's intuitive, it's instinctual, it's habitual. My students have been using these templates from early September, when our academic year begins, to May, when the exam comes. It's so easy for them to do this. Even my slow eekers can do this in time, and probably write a 4-sentence introduction as quickly as some students in the nation take to write 1 sentence. So it just, after you practice it so long, it just becomes ingrained and entrenched, and you bust them out systematically. So let's talk about the body paragraph. So if you're familiar with my work, you can fast forward this portion, and I won't belabor big definitions and histories of the syllogistic method. But when you're done with the introductions, you move on to what I call syllogistic body paragraphs. And this heuristic or template comes from Aristotle, and he ran the school called the Lyceum. And the rich aristocratic boys would go there to learn the art of polemics, oration, debate, and then the maths and the sciences, which we don't have to concern ourselves with for this. And if you think about the nature of debates, like ancient debates, you have books like Plato's Republic, and in it they throw out one question, one essential question: what is justice? And all these great philosophical think tanks come to the mic and say, this is what justice is. And they would utter a syllogism. They would put it in a syllogistic construct. And then the other philosophical thinkers would come together. They'd huddle up and say, no, 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 no. There's bullets in that argument. There's bullet holes in that argument. It's going to leak water. I don't know about that definition. So then a different philosopher would step to the mic and say, I have the definition of justice. And then they'd gather up again and say, no, 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 that's not a good definition of justice. And that's the whole book of Plato's Republic, like just all these guys trying to figure out what justice is. And each time they utter a definition, as I said, it's syllogistic. And this is all syllogism is. It's when you work from premise to conclusion. So here's an example. Premise 1, you can state arsenic is deadly. Premise 2, my dog ate arsenic. Conclusion, my dog is going to die. So when students argue which literary analysis is an argument, because all expository writing is argument, we must remember that. One thing that we're looking for, and this is all the buzz in the AP circles, is that good old line of reasoning. We want our students to be logical. We want them to be cogent from start to finish in the body paragraphs. So if they write syllogistically like this, they are bulletproof in their logic, and it's going to bode well for them, especially if they can do the nuanced things. And then even of more importance, ascertain the meaning of the text with a deliberate understanding and accurate understanding. I mean, they're gonna score so well on this. So we want them to be this locked in logically when they write. So here's what it looks like for the purposes of performing literary analysis. This is the template. So the first premise is going to be a statement that contains a literary term or device. The second premise is going to be textual support, and I always tell my students to teeter-totter balance the quoting and the paraphrasing. And the conclusion is going to be the textual analysis, and where they, I tell my students the first premise is a promise. So in the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, you kind of go back and shake hands with that promise and say, haha, I fulfilled my promise. And in doing that, you're going to have little echoes to the thesis. Right. And one point of clarification is this: when I say conclusion, I don't mean a conclusion paragraph. I mean the conclusion, the end statements of the syllogistic body paragraph. So the last couple of sentences of the body paragraph are what are called the conclusion. So students often ask me this: all right, Mr. Kuhn, we are using templates. You suggest that the introduction should be 4 sentences long. I'm sure you must have a number of sentences we should hit for a syllogistic body paragraph. And I say, yes, I do. In order to have enough textual support and analysis, you can't write a little itty bitty 4 to 5 sentence body paragraph, which we are so prone to see from our students. They just don't do enough. There aren't enough moves in there to argue. So I say shoot for 10 sentences. I think that's a full body paragraph. 10 sentences. And I put a hard cap at 12. I think they get a little too girthy and they get wayward and go on bird walks and get too plot heavy and break the line of reasoning if they exceed 12. And I do think 12 is a little bit too big, but sometimes students have so much to say about given things. So shoot for 10 is what I tell them. So here is something else to pay attention to. In the first premise, where they have to use their terms and devices, there are a couple of things that I tell my students to do. One is they say, where do I start? And in this case, in all cases, even for the poetry, I said this for The Man with the Saxophone, and uniformly I say this every time my students write about excerpts, short stories, novels, plays. etc. Any literary genre. I always tell them to do this. Start where the author starts. So in this case, they're going to start where Winton starts. And you see the transition up here where the student says, right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing the fact that you're going chronologically, you're going sequentially, which is a really good strategy to establish that line of reasoning. The other thing that you're going to note, and for those of you that watched the first video on FRQ1, you'll notice that yet again I'm saying the first premise should be 3 sentences long. Here's the reason why. On FRQ1, which is the synthesis essay on the language exam, the College Board says your argument must be central. I wish they gave that directive for every single essay, all 6 FRQs for the Lang and Lit exam, because expository writing is argument. So what happens is students begin to quote and paraphrase too early in the body paragraph, and there's a seismic shift from I'm no longer doing literary analysis, I'm doing plot analysis, and they get ding-donged for it. So if they situate the argument in 3 sentences, they cue the reader into knowing that I'm going to perform literary analysis, and I know how to argue with my literary terms and devices. So in the first premise, yet again, students are going to be using their terms and devices, and I have my students do something rather special. It's called multitasking, right? Multitask the first premise. You have to be able to link literary terms and devices together. How do they conversate together? So what's the irony have to do with like certain syntactical features? You know, how does the irony create a tone shift? Or how does a syntactical manipulation yield a tone shift? So see how pieces interlock with each other. So if they have 3 sentences to do that, they can begin to link things quite well. Otherwise, it's going to be, especially if the kid is going to analyze the totality of the passage, it'll be 1 paragraph tone, 1 paragraph syntax, 1 paragraph diction, 1 paragraph irony, 1 paragraph metaphor. And you're going to run out of time, right? And it's just going to be very methodic and a dutiful, bland essay that's not going to bode well on the rubric for them. So multitasking is important, and that takes a great deal of Bob Rossing on your behalf to show students how to do that. So start where the author starts, get anchored in your terms and devices, 3 sentences. So look at this. Right from the onset, Winton sets the stage for the emotional tug-of-war Bruce Pike will experience as the result of Loon's prank. Immediately, a series of complex contradictions characterize the setting, which later creates the central conflict of the piece, Bruce's emotional hangover. These strange ironies are woven throughout the text as the external background of the story mirrors Pike's internal struggle. So if we break this down, there's a promise. As I said, first premise is a promise. We have to talk about the conflict, the irony, and that, like, I don't know, I use this word for rhetorical analysis, but there's kind of a pathos to this that we're going to have to analyze. And then through that, ostensibly, we're also going to get at the characterization of Loon and Bruce. So we've multitasked. Now, to keep the line of reasoning, we can only talk about those terms and devices. We can't bring in anything extraneous, otherwise we're going to have logical breaks. Basically, we're going to break from the line of reasoning. So now, in the 4th sentence, we begin our second premise, and I tell my students, start quoting. Since you're starting where Winton starts, the quote should come up top the piece, right? So you don't want to draw from the middle or the end of the passage, because then you have a break in your line of reasoning, right? You have to go sequentially. You have to go in order. So let's check this out here. Begin quoting, and the quote needs to be germane to the first premise. So the quote needs to be linked to those terms. The setting runs parallel to the mood and is in flux as spring gives way to summer, and the crude springboard, brown, tan, and cold as hell water simultaneously gives way to a swimming area that is very slow flowing and safe to swim. So this is something cool that this student did. Do you see how they're just word playing here? This is tight diction analysis, when you can just play with the language of the excerpt and fuse it into your embedded quote. So I think this kid quoted like 5 times in one sentence. Small quotes, keep the quotes conversational. So for embedded quotes, I have a simple strategy for this. I call it the 5-word rule. If a student uses a minimum, so not exactly, a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote small, they should be able to sound conversational as they're moving in and out of the quotes, right? That's very skillful and helps with the voice point. All right, so we have this quote. Now we have to analyze it and stay true to the lit term that we are analyzing for that line of reasoning to be established. Nothing is congruent as are Pike's emotions and reflections upon how to feel about the woman, in that he never had the remotest thing in common with Loon except a friendship whose foundation was built upon a mutual admiration of pranking. So we're aligned. Man, we're really lockstepped on this. We're honed in. We're logically progressing through this very tightly. What ultimately tugs at this passage is the transference and disbursement of power, a power typically held by adults. Upon seeing that Loon is drowning, apparently, the prank yanks at their own ears as an adult might reprimand a child, but in this case the binary gets flipped in that Loon is the one controlling the strings. Bruce is torn in that the sluggish water seemed harmless, yet he had no reason to doubt there was a crisis. As Bruce dives into the water, the mere act allows him to become taller all of a sudden, as he acts the part of an adult. So go back to the first premise and ask yourself, are all these quotes germane to the literary terms and devices we dropped up there? Absolutely yes. This kid is quoting with deliberation, and here's the kicker with this. When you're using templates, sometimes students are like, I'm in the second premise, I got to quote, I got to paraphrase, and then they're just willy-nilly and arbitrary about it. No. You have to quote with deliberation, right? So everything needs to be linked together for that line of reasoning. And yet again, I hearken back to this. In order for students to achieve this and be able to do it, you got to Bob Ross the heck out of your instruction. You need to show them lots and lots and lots of examples of this and talk them through the process. So it goes on to the next slide here. At this moment, the oscillation of his feelings toward the event and the woman begin. Watching Loon go red and with pleasure as he exerts all his freckles brings Bruce back down to the size of being a kid. But the adult emotions of feeling more guilt than glee also wash over him. He feels embarrassed for the woman, yet can understand Loon's delight. We got plenty of support and analysis in there. So note how many times the student drew from the text exactly. So they have quotes. There's a good deal of quotes, but all the quotes are small. So I like it when my students parcel out their quotes like that. I don't want to see big block quotations. That's clumsy diction analysis. So wordplay, use the author's words, for your conversation with the reader, right? Embed. So now we're at the conclusion. We need to shake hands back to that first premise and also echo the thesis. This usually takes 2 to 3 sentences, and that's it. So again, no, it's the conclusion of the syllogistic body paragraph, not the conclusion of the essay. So several emotions and sentiments ride the teeter-totter in this moment. First, the power dynamic shifts back and forth, for at the end, the woman took back some kind of authority, but in this moment, Bruce feels a mix of sympathy and contempt for her. This contradictory pull is what fuels the story, but it's also what drives the internal framework of a kid trying to understand his world. So that's a full syllogism there. That took 12 sentences. You can see it's a little on the long side. They probably could have trimmed a couple of sentences, but no big deal. I mean, it's perfectly logical. Sustains that nice tight line of reasoning, and it's really good. So I think this kid's going to rock a pretty high score from any reader of this exam. So that's how the template works. One of the questions I get is, what's the student supposed to do in the next body paragraph? Boom, bust out another syllogism. You still have those smaller bit part literary terms and devices that you still have to analyze. So move into that, switch up your quotes, switch up your lit terms and devices, and hammer it out. So my students on the exam write 4 paragraphs, intro, 2 bodies, and a conclusion. So they still have 1 more to go, but I would be talking for 2 hours per video if I were to do that. So you get the sense of how this works, and hopefully you can demonstrate for your students how to do it by writing a couple of exemplars on your own. So Bob Ross your instruction, and try your hand at giving them plenty of models and exemplars. Be the expert in the classroom. Stand up at the easel and do the proverbial painting of the essay with your students, like I just did with you. So if you want to learn more about my classes that I offer, or if you want to work with me more closely and learn some of my tricks, you can find information on me at teachinghowtowrite.com. So the address is right there. There's a contact section there if you want to email me. And if you want this particular PowerPoint that we just looked at, feel free to email me and I'll send it on to you. As I've said in the group, Tim Freitas and I are working on a textbook together. So I'm offering it's called the Teach It Right 5-week mastermind. So I'm going to be working with teachers in order to gather data for that textbook. So if you want to be part of a special project, reach out and I can give you more information about that. So Tim and I can make you famous. No, I'm just joking. So hopefully it's a well-received book, which I think it will be. So that's it for now. Hopefully you found this to be useful and can incorporate it into your classroom. For now, happy teaching and happy writing.